W. Cline, private, U.S. Army, and 1612287 serial number, and enlisted in the Army Reserve in the fall of 1943 at Blackburn College. Actually, it was the fall of 42, I'm sorry, because I got called to active duty in the spring of 43. So I enlisted in the fall of 42, and they let us, if we kept our grades up, we could have that 1 year of school, because they were taking men in like crazy, and they needed to smooth the process down a little bit.
Okay, let's see, what else do we need to tell? Birth date?
Birth date, 1st of February, 1924.
Address, current address?
506 Maple, Abingdon, Illinois, 61410.
And Steve Long is attending the interview, or is the interviewer, and we don't have to worry about institutional affiliation, and I am the nephew of Uncle Fred here.
Right,
so
right.
We're going to talk a little bit about a variety of activities. You mentioned that you enlisted in 42,
yes.
fall of 42,
Right.
in the Army Reserve.
Right.
They let you have that year of schooling, but then you actually went active duty in...
May 24th, 1943.
Okay.
At Camp Grant, Illinois, which would be up near Rockford.
Okay. And what got you started thinking about joining the reserve?
Well, it was obvious that we could be drafted, and I had a foolish idea prior to the war down at Blackburn College. I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian, and the Army still had horse cavalry, and I made a very, very foolish move, because a number of my friends went into the Navy V-12 program, which includes the checking of meat, milk, sanitary condition in the mess hall by veterinarians, and the Navy has them, and a number of my friends became veterinarians, and I don't know of a single one that did in the Army.
Huh.
We all got kicked back in the infantry after a college program that we were in.
Okay.
So if you think you made a false assumption as a dumb kid, none of your family had ever been in the military, didn't have the slightest idea what you were doing. But in this case, I thought that this was the one that would be more likely to lead me to a training as a veterinarian, and it just didn't happen.
Yep. So the Army in particular was pushing that program.
It's just the fact that I knew there was still horse cavalry. I mean, nobody promised me anything. I made some bad assumptions.
Okay, and that was the reason for the choice of the service arm that you went into.
Army over Navy.
You said, okay, horses.
That's right.
That's it. Okay.
That's not. It did not work.
Right. Yep. Very interesting. Now, do you recall your first days in active service?
Well, we were being processed up at Camp Grant, which means a bunch of tests and some physical stuff, and of course, quite a physical exam. And they were doing it wholesale, and there's a bunch of men running around in their birthday suits, losing whatever whatever reservations they have in a hurry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we were several days at Camp Grant, and then loaded on a train and shipped down near Macon, Georgia, to a place called Camp Wheeler. And I checked with some people in the Georgia area recently. I was in a barber shop, and I asked anybody if you'd ever heard of Camp Wheeler, and it's a non-entity. And these guys were shocked to find out that 50-some years ago there were 30,000 men there taking infantry training.
Wow.
And most of our Army installations were named for some famous general. I don't know who Wheeler was, but it doesn't make any difference.
He wasn't famous to the folks who were there anyway, huh?
And you learn very early in the infantry that their dog face or whatever, the infantry is a very demeaning, there's not a lot of men run around with a whole lot of pride being there. And that's what they needed mostly, because D-Day was some distance away, but ultimately that became the rallying cry. Right.
What about your early training experience? You mentioned you went down to Wheeler to do some training. What kind of things did they have you doing?
Well, June, July, and August, they rolled us out of there about 6 o'clock in the morning and gave us some breakfast. And then we would be into physical activity involving running, or going at a fast pace, all kinds of calisthenics, push-ups. We were just kids, 18, 19-year-old kids, and we were in not too bad a shape. And so June, July, and August, 3 of the hottest months of the season, we're down there in Georgia, and that red clay soil.
When did they first give you a rifle?
Actually, about maybe 6 weeks into our training, we had a rifle. For one thing, you needed to get used to a pack, a gas mask, the rifle, the leggings, and so, and that rifle weighs several pounds.
Mm-hmm.
And if you keep that rifle over your shoulder all day and you're swinging your arm, you're going to find it'll cut off some circulation. So there's times you'd like to have been able to put that. Now, sometimes they would give you call out a command to put the weapon on the other side.
Huh.
But out hiking, that rifle is your baby, and it's your responsibility. And you want to learn to be able to take that thing apart in a hurry. You want to be able to probably be able to do it in the dark. And then, of course, you have little cotton patches of material that you pull through the barrel, and then you put a light coating of oil on that. So you were cleaning your rifle and taking care of it because it was the critical weapon, along with a bayonet.
Yep.
And that came later also in the training.
Okay. Yep.
And we walked something in excess of 400 miles in 12 weeks. And I will never, well, obviously, first of all, at that age, I'll just never be in better physical shape than by the time I finished basic training, me and hundreds of other people.
Sure.
And you're in a platoon of 60 men, and there's a platoon sergeant. This is a buck sergeant, 3 stripes. And we had a fine sergeant. If you kept the rules, if you got out of there on time, you did. If you just did everything well, you're okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if you hadn't gotten the message that you need to be out on the formation on time or wherever on time, why he had a way of working on it.
Now, and I guess the second piece, that just gives us a little bit of background in terms of getting started in the processing. How about a little bit about which wars you were involved in, Uncle Fred, and then we'll talk a little bit about where exactly you went and so on.
Well, I was, of course, World War II, and as it turned out, and I think I'm fortunate that we went to Europe, although I had men that have been in the Pacific tell me that the living conditions of the Pacific were much worse than Europe, but the firepower in Europe was much overpowering.
Mm-hmm.
So the climate was bad in the Pacific, but the firepower was much worse. And a few men came back somewhat early in the war that had gotten. They came up with a material later that I used in the Pacific called atabrine. But the Japanese didn't think that the white man could make it in the Pacific because of malaria. And so the medical people, whoever came up with a thing called atabrine, but at a later stage we took atabrine every day. But a lot of the men in the early days of the Pacific, it wasn't available. So a lot of these guys got malaria and were shipped back to the States.
Okay.
And then in some cases were given additional training and went, so some guys went from the Pacific to Europe, which was the lesser number, and then the major number was the ones that went to Europe. But then the ones that went, there was bigger, the military, the Army and the Marines in Europe were a much bigger number.
Mm-hmm.
But then the fact that I went to the Pacific later, there wasn't a lot of that. A lot of those men were discharged because he'd been in quite a while.
Yep.
and the war was winding down. The Pacific was, I actually was only down the Pacific a few months, and I was down there when the war ended, and that's probably one of the happiest days of my life.
Mm-hmm. And then did you do some Korean as well?
I spent 15 months in the Korean affair from the summer of 51 till the fall of 52, and was ordered to the Brooklyn Army Base, which was a huge installation, about 1,200 men, and the day before I got to the Brooklyn Army Base, they had shipped a training officer to Germany. And so I asked the personnel officer in Brooklyn what was so special about me being called back on active duty. He showed me a number that was on my orders of a critical MOS, military occupational specialty, of a superintendent of a railroad terminal. Well, I'd worked in the railroad as a flunky, but they got me on active duty with this MOS, and he said, now you're here, we're going to put you where we want you. So don't get the idea there isn't a way of getting you there.
Yeah.
Because I thought, well, what's so special about an ag teacher in Kewanee? That had nothing to do with it. They had other plans for me.
Okay.
And I was very fortunate in that fact that this officer went out, and the personnel individual said to me, would you rather be in training or would you rather be down on the dock handling freight? And I said, I'll take training.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, I see that you just came out of a classroom.
Yeah.
So that's where we were in that area.
Yep. So you spent your 15 months in
I spent 15
Brooklyn.
months at the Brooklyn Army Base.
Base.
Yeah.
Yep.
And down on the waterfront of New York, down in that harbor area, I'm not sure at some instances I might have been safer in Korea, because there was a criminal element down there like I wish didn't happen.
Yep.
Not that I was directly involved,
Mm-hmm.
but we locked our car in the daytime, and that's the first time I'd ever done that.
Yep.
Right.
You didn't have to do that in DeLong.
No.
Now, you've highlighted it a little bit, but can you sort of step us through where you started, in terms of in the war itself, when you went over to Europe,
Okay.
the locations, and
Okay.
then sort of take us chronologically through to the Pacific and so
Okay.
on.
Well, we did 13 weeks of basic in Georgia, and we shipped out there and got into Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the middle of the night, and the Army had 130,000 men in a program called ASTP, Army Specialized Training Program. And a lot of that training was intended for after the war, military, government, and the whole 9 yards. And then somebody took a hard look at D-Day and said, we are going to need a lot of raw meat, and I'm just being brutally frank.
Mm-hmm.
And 130,000 cadets were terminated in the spring of 1944 in March, and we were dumped back in the infantry along with about 30,000 air cadets, because the losses had, the loss of planes in 1944 had really, we began to dominate the skies. And so 30,000 air cadets got dumped back in the, about 165,000 of us were stuck back in the infantry and given a few weeks of realistic training, because you're on your way, in this case, to Europe. So I happened to be sent to a camp south of Indianapolis called Camp Atterbury, and I was assigned to the 106th Infantry Division, the 423rd Regiment, K Company, which was a rifle company. And so my training there, maneuvers and one thing and another, was all in preparation. And of course we threw some grenades, and we practiced on machine guns, and we practiced on mortars. And then they pulled 1,500 of us out in July of 1944, and we went from south of Indianapolis to Fort Meade, Maryland, and we were given shots and given some more indoctrination at Fort Meade, and we were there some period of time, less than a month, and then we were put on a train to Boston, and Miles Standish, that made sense. We went to Camp Miles Standish, and on the 10th day of September, I joined thousands of other men on a troop ship, and we pulled out of Boston. And I can tell you, to stand up on the deck as the day ends, and finally you can't see land. So you're out in the Atlantic Ocean, and the ship is changing course very subtly every 2 minutes. And at some point in the next few days, you finally get a hold of somebody from the crew and said, "What is this all about?" I said, "It's real simple. This is to keep a submarine from landing up on us." So it wasn't anything violent. It was pretty subtle. But you now are in submarine infested waters, and 7 days later, on the 17th day of September, we land at Liverpool. And I assumed that we were in a country of English-speaking people, and some of those stevedores come on board, and their accent and the whole night, you almost wondered if you were truly in England. We got off the boat. We have our pack with us, which is our bedding and our spare clothes and some shaving kit and some of this sort of thing. The Red Cross was there with coffee and donuts. We got off the ship. We walked over a short distance. We got a cup of coffee and a donut and proceeded to walk to the train. The train was loading, and I don't think I was in Liverpool 2 hours.
Wow.
And that train pulled out, and we rode that train all night. And the next day we went near Coventry, and Hitler had really gotten mad at the British Air Force, particularly at Spitfire, because the British changed the odds, and of course the Americans helped, but the British started it early. They changed the odds in the air, and Hitler got really unhappy, and he picked out a town in England to make an example of. In the meantime, the British intelligence has broken the German code. So they've broken the code and found out that Hitler is going to bomb Coventry, so we can't evacuate Coventry because the Germans would know the British knew.
Yes.
And what they did to Coventry was pretty bad news.
Wow.
And that was the first visual evidence of what we were getting into. And then we went through the outskirts of London and could see some damage. And by evening, we're at Southampton. And so we get off the train and get on a British ship. And the next afternoon, we come down over the side of that ship to the landing craft and go into Omaha Beach. And the beach is secured. We're not involved, except there are mines and booby traps, so let's don't get curious or silly. And the other part of that is, as you are riding during the day on that British ship towards Omaha Beach, there are gas masks and there's other material floating around and somebody didn't make it.
Right.
And so you increase the amount of realism. And you're all a bunch of kids, and the truth is you're all scared silly.
How much about D-Day did you hear?
Well, it was in the States, and Omaha Beach took the worst penalty. There were 5 beaches. The U.S. was Omaha and Utah. Somebody was Sword. I can't tell you the 5 beaches, but Omaha happened to catch the worst of the 5. And I think, just talking to some of the men involved later on, I think a lot of guys really doubted that we had made it. I mean, the casualties were so bad that there was a real question. And then we come to the hedgerows. Those hedgerows had been there for a long time, and aerial photos showed they were there. And to whoever might be the big planner, they missed it because we needed special equipment in those hedgerows. And a lot of American boys died because some general, somebody who should have known what he's doing, had no special way of dealing with those hedgerows. and they took those hedgerows one at a time, almost like street fighting. And I had a good friend here, Ralph Legate, went over 100 days in those hedgerows, and he got it bad. He didn't get killed, but he got it bad. And he could tell me some things, but those hedgerows were there. We knew they were there, and yet there wasn't any special device on the front of a tank to pierce them, and it just was an oversight. It was a very serious flaw.
Now the hedgerows were rows of trees
to divide, to outline the particular land that a farmer owned. But these GIs, our GIs are on one side of that sucker, and the Germans are dug in on the other side. And there's no question in my mind, some awfully fine young men died because there was not intelligence of some special equipment to get through those hedgerows.
So it was essentially like a big fence.
Exactly, a big wooden fence that no kid can penetrate, and the Germans are right on the other side of it.
Firing right through there.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it was a bad one, and then in our case, we were put in a truck over to a place called Le Mans, which is now a big race area. And so we're moved from Omaha Beach to Le Mans, and that's where we get the rifle that we're going to carry into combat.
Okay.
And there's a rifle range there. You're going to fire your weapon and find out if it has any unusual characteristics. You're going to get a feel for what that rifle will do. So
until then, you're carrying the stuff, the basic pack in
and riding in a truck. I mean,
right.
And then when we got done with that, well, we took turns. Some guys are firing their rifles, and other guys are working behind a big pile of dirt with the targets up above you. And then a bunch of us were down there and pulled targets. Now, we're not going to get hit, but those bullets are going right over your head. Kind of a little orientation.
Yes. You're getting a dose of what's to come.
And then again, because of limitations of space and equipment and so forth, our particular group, a bunch of us, were taken over to a bunch of little French boxcars called the 40 and 8. They go back to World War I, and these little French cars would hold 8 horses or 40 soldiers. And they just threw some containers of rations in those wood boxcars, and the train took off, and now we're on a train. We went through Paris and ultimately to Verdun, and got off at Verdun. And then we go to a replacement depot, and that's when 4 of us got split up. And within 48 hours from the time we were assigned to our units, all 4 of us were in combat.
Mm-hmm.
And in one case, one guy only made it 9 days. And some of the kids that came up to the unit that I happened to go into didn't even make it 12 hours. So,
wow.
I cannot describe the fear. You can feel the sweat running down the inside of your arm.
Mm-hmm.
If a shell hit not too far away, why, there was shrapnel, and so it was just, and of all things, we were, the first night in combat with the 4th Armored Division, we were dug in, and anti-tank outfit came up at night. And these jokers were firing at the Germans during the night, and the next morning we start getting counterfire. The guys come up and fired behind us to the German line, and then they pulled back, and we got quite an initiation right away.
Wow.
And I was in the 4th Armored Division, 10th Armored Infantry. I was in the headquarters company, which would include the machine gun platoon of 34 men, the mortar platoon of about 30 men, the INR platoon, which is the guys that go behind enemy lines, and then some clerk typists and some other incidentals. But I joined when there was 20 young green troops in my little handful that went up to the machine gun platoon to replenish their manpower. There should have been 34 of us, and plus an officer, and there were 5 men left when I got to the machine gun platoon. and another kid and I crawled back and got some rations the next day, and 5 of those kids got hit the first morning. Now, I don't know whether they were killed or all I know they weren't there. So from then on, it's a matter of percentage.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew, oh, an interesting thing. Our training in the States was, if you're captured, to give them only name, rank, and serial number. The simple facts are they gave us a 4th Armored Division patch and had us sew it on our field jacket to show them who we were. I mean, we're not trying to hide who we belong to. We're the 4th Armored Division, and you guys better get out of the way, because the slogan of the 4th Armored Division was name enough, name enough.
Mm.
But I knew I'd come from an outfit in the States that was somewhat low morale into an outfit that had morale sky high. They really believed in themselves.
Yeah.
My battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel West from Texas, was 26 years old, in charge of 1,200 men, or a number somewhere near there. I don't know if he ever had full strength.
Wow.
Yeah.
26-year-old.
26-year-old Lieutenant Colonel, and I understand he was hit later, but it was not killed. I have no idea if he made it through the war.
Mm-hmm.
Nor do I know what happened. I know that Sergeant Dezicki got killed. I know that my squad sergeant Pop got killed, and frankly, some of those guys were coming in there late afternoon or at night and maybe getting hit. I could very easily be sitting next to a guy that I was in the same platoon and wouldn't even know who he was.
Mm-hmm.
It was a process.
Yeah.
The Germans pulled their units offline. The Americans put men in and kept them online.
Mm-hmm.
And well, we ended up winning the thing, so maybe that was part of it.
Yeah. So you stayed in that area then for how long?
No, we moved out.
Okay.
I mean, we're on the move in a couple of days.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the medium tanks are ahead of us, and then we're in the machine gun platoon. And our mission is to keep the German infantry away from our tanks. And so that was our, and we rode in half tracks, other than regular infantry would just be walking wherever they went.
Mm-hmm.
But in our case, we were armored infantry, and we had a 50 caliber machine gun on the front of each half track, and we had 2 water-cooled 30s, one on each side, 30 calibers. So we had 3 machine guns, and in a matter of an hour or two, we could throw an awful lot of lead.
Mm-hmm.
And the Germans had some more superior weapons in some instances than we had, but the Germans had nothing to compare with the 50 caliber machine gun. It was a big shell, and we learned another stunt very early: pull the tracers out, because the tracers tell the enemy exactly where we are, location physically. So while the tracers might tell you where you're shooting, it also tells somebody else where you are.
Yeah. Now, what's a tracer?
It's a bullet that will show the light as it's moving.
Okay.
In other words, it's got some.
Now, why would you want that?
Well, one of the theories was that it would show you where your target was, but by the same token, it shows the enemy where you are.
Yeah. It depends which side you're looking at, doesn't
exactly
it?
Right. Now, in the daytime, you wouldn't do a lot of harm, but at night, forget it.
Yeah.
But there was just certain things that other men had learned before we got there.
Yeah.
And God knows men died because there were things to be learned that had to be learned the hard way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I will never forget, as some kid from the States, as we walked up to these 5 muddy, bearded, dirty, they looked awful. They'd been in combat for weeks. And some kid said, "We're looking for the machine gun platoon," and a big Polak from Hamtramck, Michigan, Sergeant